Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in retrospect, he pointed out that probably would have been a good idea to end the Vietnam War at that point, to pull out. Contrary to a lot of illusions, the Vietnam War was fought primarily to ensure that an independent Vietnam would not develop successfully and become a model for other countries in the region. It would not, to borrow Henry Kissinger's terminology, speaking about Chile, we have to prevent it, what he called the virus of independent development from spreading contagion elsewhere. That's a critical part of American foreign policy since the Second World War, Britain, France, others to a lesser degree. And by 1965, that was over. South Vietnam was virtually destroyed. The war had spread to the rest of Indochina. It wasn't going to be a model for anyone. And the contagion was contained. The Suharto regime made sure that Indonesia wouldn't be infected, and pretty soon the U.S. had dictatorships in every country of the region. Marcos in the Philippines, a dictatorship in Thailand, Chun in South Park in South Korea. It was no problem about the infection. So that would have been a good time to end the Vietnam War, he felt. Well, that's Southeast Asia. But the decline continues. In the last 10 years, there's been a very important event, the loss of South America. For the first time in 500 years, since the conquistadors, the South American countries have begun to move towards independence and a degree of integration. The typical structure of one of the South American countries was a tiny, very rich, westernized elite, often white or mostly white, and a huge mass of horrible poverty, countries separated from one another, each oriented towards either Europe or more recently the United States. Last 10 years, that's been overcome significantly, beginning to integrate, the prerequisite for independence, even beginning to face some of their horrendous internal problems. That's the loss of South America. One sign is that the United States has been driven out of every single military base in South America, trying to restore a few, but right now they're not. Well, moving on to just last year, the Arab Spring is another such threat. It threatens to take that big region out of the grand area. That's a lot more significant than Southeast Asia or South America. You go back to the 1940s, the State Department recognized that the energy resources of the Middle East are what they called one of the greatest material prizes in world history, a spectacular source of strategic power. If we can control Middle East energy, we can control the world. You take a look at the U.S.-British coup in Iran in 1953. Very important event. Its shadows cast over the world until today. That was a pretense that it was part of the Cold War. It had nothing to do with the Cold War. What it had to do was the usual fear, independent nationalism. And it wasn't even concerned with access to oil or profits. It was concerned with control of the oil resources of Iran and, in fact, of the region. And that's a theme that runs right through policy decisions, not discussed much, but it's very important to have control, exactly as State Department advisors pointed out in the 40s. If you can control the oil, you can control most of the world, and that goes on. So far, the threat of the Arab Spring has been pretty well contained in the oil dictatorships, which are the most important ones for the West. Every effort to join the Arab Spring has just been crushed by force. Saudi Arabia was so extreme that when there was an effort to go out into the streets, the security presence was so enormous that people were even afraid to go out. There's a little discussion of what goes on in Bahrain, where it's been crushed, but eastern Saudi Arabia was much worse. The Emirates totally controlled. So that's okay. We managed to ensure that the threat of democracy would be smashed in the most important places. Egypt is an interesting case. It's an important country, not an oil producer. It is a small one. But in Egypt, the United States followed a standard operating procedure. If any of you are going into the diplomatic service, you might as well learn it. There's a standard procedure when one of your favorite dictators gets into trouble. First, you support him as long as possible. But if it becomes really impossible, say the army turns against him, then you send him out to pasture and get the intellectual class to issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and then try to restore the old system as much as possible. There's case after case of that. Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Marcos in the Philippines, Chun in South Korea, Mobutu in the Congo, over and over. I mean, it takes genius not to see it. And it's exactly what was done in Egypt and what France tried to do, not quite with as much success in Tunisia. Well, the future is uncertain, but the threat of democracy so far is contained, and it's a real threat. I'll return to that. It's also important to recognize that the decline over the past 50 years is, to a significant extent, self-inflicted, particularly since the 70s. I'll come back to that too. But first, let me say a couple of things about the issues that are most important today and that are being ignored or not dealt with seriously in the electoral campaigns for good reasons. So let me start with the most important issues. There are two of these. They're of overwhelming significance because the fate of the species depends on them. The one is environmental disaster, the other is nuclear war. I'm not going to take much time reviewing the threats of environmental disaster. Actually, they're on the front pages almost daily. So, for example, last week, the New York Times had a front page story with the headline, "Ending its Summer Melt, Arctic Sea Ice Sets a New Low." That leads to warnings. The melting this summer was far faster than was predicted by the sophisticated computer models and the most recent United Nations report. It's now predicted that the summer ice might be gone by 2020. It was assumed before that it maybe 2050. They quoted scientists who said, "This is a prime example of the built-in conservatism of our climate forecasts. As dire the warnings are about the long-term consequences of heat-trapping emissions, many of us fear that they may still be underestimating the speed and severity of the impending changes." Actually, there's a climate change study program at MIT where I am. They've been warning about this for years and repeatedly have been proven right. The Times report discusses briefly the severe impact of all of this on the global climate, and it adds, but governments have not responded to the change with any greater urgency about limiting greenhouse emissions. To the contrary, their main response has been to plan for exploitation of newly accessible minerals in the Arctic, including drilling for more oil. That is, to accelerate the catastrophe. That's quite interesting. It demonstrates an extraordinary willingness to sacrifice the lives of our children and grandchildren for short-term gain, or perhaps an equally remarkable willingness to shut our eyes so as not to see impending peril. There's things you sometimes find with young infants. Something looks dangerous. Close my eyes and won't look at it. Well, there is another possibility. I mean, maybe humans are somehow trying to fulfill a prediction of great American biologist who died recently, Ernst Mayr. He argued years ago that intelligence seems to be a lethal mutation. He had some pretty good evidence. There's a notion of biological success, which is how many of you are there around? That's biological success. And he pointed out that if you look at the tens of billions of species in world history, the ones that are very successful are the ones that mutate very quickly, like bacteria, or the ones that have a fixed ecological niche, like beetles. They seem to make out fine. But as you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, success declines steadily. When you get up to mammals, it's very low. There are very few of them around. And there's a lot of cows. It's only because we domesticate them. When you get to humans, it's the same. Till very recently, much too recent a time to show up in any evolutionary accounting, the humans were very scattered. There were plenty of other hominids, but they disappeared. Probably because humans exterminated them, but nobody knows for sure. Anyhow, maybe we're trying to show that humans just fit into the general pattern. We can exterminate ourselves too, the rest of the world with us, and we're hell-bent on it right now.